Thank you, Greg. If you've never been to Greg's pasture walk, it's definitely worth taking the day to go to that. It's a joyous event every year for me. I always learn something when I go to that pasture walk. Before I get started, one thing I wanted to mention was that we're recording these presentations today, and they'll be available on our KY Forage's YouTube channel. So just search KY Forage, all one word, YouTube, and it'll bring it right up. But there's probably about, I don't know, maybe 500 or 600 other videos on there that you can watch on anything related to forage and livestock management, and from past conferences and so forth.
I'll mention my farmhand drives about an hour to work every day, and he's always quoting Chris on his podcast.
So last year we had about 180,000 views on that, and my wife's like, what are wrong with these people? You know? So anyways, it's just not me on there. There's a whole bunch of different speakers on there from different conferences. Anyways, I want to talk a little bit about forage management in a changing climate, and whether you think it's man-induced change or not, it doesn't really matter. The climate's changing. And last week was a great example in western Kentucky. Guess what we got last week? 3 months of rain in 3 days. 16.5 inches in 3 days. So things are changing. Unfortunately, I can't save all that water for July and August, but things are changing. I mean, we're seeing more severe weather events, more flood events. In thinking about how that impacts how we manage forages is really important as we move ahead. So I'm going to talk about several things today. The first one is just a brief overview of changing weather patterns, just to kind of set the stage for the discussion. And then we'll talk about strategies for managing short-term drought stress in grazing systems. A little funny to talk about that after 16.5 inches of rain, but really we're only several weeks away from a drought in most situations, so it's always important to keep that in mind. We'll talk about strategies for producing high-quality stored forage in a changing environment. And then we'll finish up talking about strategies for reclaiming pastures that have incurred a little bit of damage due to the wet winters that we're experiencing now. This has probably been one of the wettest winters that I can remember in a long time. And if you've got livestock and you've got moisture and you've got soil, you're going to have some pugged up pastures. And in a dry fall, yeah. So we really need to be thinking about how do we handle those areas that have had some disturbance. And disturbance isn't always a bad thing. I mean, we can switch species around and change botanical composition with a little bit of planned disturbance. But I will tell you, this winter we were doing some bale grazing, and we were allocating enough bales and stockpile grass for 1 to 2 days, and we had a 3-inch rain event on one of those strips. And I mean, when I looked at it, I said, man, we really made a bad mistake. And it has recovered fairly well, much better than I thought it would recover at this point in time. All right, so let's go ahead and start. So this is a chart that was put together by our UK meteorologist, Matthew Dixon. If you've never been to the UK Ag Weather site, they have a little app. It's a pretty nice little app, and I would encourage you to download that onto your phone. And it's ag related. But these are the top 10 wettest years on record from 1895 to 2020. What I want you to notice, and I highlighted them in green, is that 5 of those 10 years occurred since 2011. Pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. And when we look at rainfall changes, if you look at the humid eastern United States, we're tending to get more rainfall than we have in the past. And we start to look at states like Kentucky and Tennessee, we're seeing increases in long-term precipitation trends of 2 to 4 inches. So we're getting more moisture than we've ever gotten before. So that's kind of interesting as we move forward. Now, unfortunately, in the western United States, they're kind of going in the wrong direction. they're tend to be drier than they have in the past, and that's causing more drought in the western United States. Okay, so keep this in mind as we move forward and we start talking about making stored forage when we're getting more and more rainfall. This is kind of an interesting diagram. So this was the USDA plant hardiness zones. So what that's looking at is the average minimum temperature during the winter months. And this was 1990. And then this map beside it is 2015 when they redid the zones. As you can see, the average minimum temperature in the winter months is getting warmer. That means those zones are moving northward. And that's impacting the botanical composition of our pastures. We're starting to see more things in our pastures that may have been better adapted in states like North Carolina and South Carolina, more warm season grasses coming in. They're being more competitive in our cool season grass stands. And that has to cause us to think about, do we need to shift management in how do we change management to encourage cool season grasses, but also promote the growth of some of these warm season grasses that are slowly creeping northward. So let's talk a little bit about drought and grassland ecosystems. And there was an old study, 1970, it was done in the Mid-Atlantic, and they kind of concluded that we're going to have a moderate drought, one out of every 5 years, and a pretty good one once a decade or so. In my experience, that's pretty accurate. We're going to have short-term drought stress. Even though we're getting more precipitation than we've ever gotten before, that doesn't mean we're not going to have short-term drought stress in grazing systems. And it's important that we're ready for that short-term drought stress. Drought always seems to be a surprise to us. I don't know exactly why. Maybe we're perpetual optimists, but whenever we have a drought, we're like, man, I've never seen this before. But we have. One thing that I want you to take home with today is that drought rarely kills well-managed pasture. If you've got a pasture and you're doing everything right on it, we can have a pretty moderate drought and that pasture is going to survive. Unfortunately, not all pastures are well managed. And those are the ones that become really susceptible to short-term drought stress. And we need to be thinking about not what we do during a drought, but how do we get ready for that drought so that when that drought comes, we're in the driver's seat, not the drought. Everybody knows the old parable about the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? We just keep adding more and more and more to it until finally the back of the camel breaks. And that's kind of what drought is like, and that's how I kind of approach drought management in grazing systems. We start out and we do things like plant a marginally adapted species. So something that maybe would do well in Ohio or Pennsylvania, we plant it here in Kentucky or Tennessee, and so it's growing, but it's not the best adapted species. And then maybe our stocking rate's not quite right. Maybe we're stocked a little bit higher than we should be. And then we haven't done a real good job with our soil fertility program. So maybe we need some phosphorus or potassium, or maybe it needs a shot of lime, but we're kind of marginal on our soil fertility. And then the biggie, maybe we're not rotational stocking. Maybe we've got a continuously stocked system, or maybe a really loose rotational system that we're not managing well. So poor grazing management. And then along comes a moderate drought, and our pastures die, and we say, the drought killed our pastures. Well, maybe, but the drought is kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I've got all this background stuff going on. I've got poor soil fertility, poor grazing management, I'm overstocked, and then a drought adds that straw that breaks the camel's back, and we lose that pasture. That's really important to understand, that if we have a well-managed grazing system, a moderate drought is going to set it back a little bit, but it's not going to kill that pasture. It's the accumulation of the stresses. That's what kills a pasture during a moderate drought event. So what do? We can't predict or prevent a drought from happening, but what we can do is think about how we manage to mitigate the impact of that drought in our grazing system and to promote recovery after that drought-ending rain comes. So that's the two things that we really need to be focusing on. So the first one, and Julia talked about that this morning, is stocking rate. Stocking rate is so important in the whole management of pastures. If we don't have stocking rate right, if we're overstocked, it's going to be hard to make changes within that grazing system and make that grazing system sustainable. So getting stocking rate right is critical. This is Mott's diagram. Gerald Mott was a professor that kind of came up with this diagram, and what it shows is the impact of stocking rate. So on the bottom we have stocking rate. As we move from left to right, we're increasing stocking rate. And then we've got two lines on this graph. We've got a solid line. This is output, animal output per unit land area. And then this is individual animal output or individual animal performance is the dotted line. So what we can see is that when we're at a real low stocking rate, our individual animal performance is really good, but we're not producing much per acre, right? Because we don't have very many animals. As we increase stocking rate, we dramatically increase the output per unit land area, but individual animal performance goes down. So we're not maximizing individual animal performance, but we're optimizing the production of the system as we increase stocking rate. Where these two lines cross at, that's kind of the sweet spot. That's where we've got decent animal performance and we've got good output per unit land area, good production per unit of land area. That's where we need to be. It's just not where those two lines cross, but it's that zone around those two lines is what we call the optimal stocking rate. Now, the most important thing on this graph is what happens after that optimal zone. So what are you seeing? What happens after that optimal zone? The whole system crashes, right? And unfortunately, a lot of farms in states like Kentucky and Tennessee are pushing this optimal stocking rate. And when we get there, individual animal performance declines, and the whole system, the productivity per unit of land area declines. The whole system crashes. So getting stocking rate right is really, really important, and there's a whole bunch of factors that impact what your stocking rate should be. I can't stand up here and tell you exactly what your stocking rate should be on your farm. You have to consider things like your soil resource. Do you have deep, well-drained, fertile soils? Did I just describe your pasture soils? Probably not. I described row crop fields, but our pasture fields are usually sloping. They have shallower soils. They probably were eroded in the past. So they're going to have overall lower potential to produce forage than a deep, well-drained soil. Your rainfall, we seem to be getting plenty of rainfall, right? But it's coming in larger events that are less frequent, and that's going to be a challenge as we move forward. And then grazing management. How are we managing those pastures? That's absolutely critical. Are we rotating? Do we have a fairly frequent rotation, or are we basing our rotation on plant height rather than number of days? If we're doing a good job with grazing management, then we can increase the productivity of our soils in pastures over time. So just a general, to throw a number out, you know, we're going to be somewhere between 2 and 4 acres per cow-calf unit, depending on all these considerations above in this region. You know, I always encourage people, if you're just getting started, don't overstock. You're much better off to start at a lighter stocking density and kind of work your way up as that system kind of comes together. And it's not like we just change management and something happens immediately. In a grazing system, it's going to take several years to really make changes with management in that grazing system. So what you need to do is just get a plan together and stay the course. And in 3 or 4 years, you're going to see really big changes start to happen within that system. The other thing about stocking rate is that if you're stocked a little bit lower, you're going to have the potential to graze more days of the year and reduce the amount of conserved forage that you have in your system. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, the second thing is soil fertility. And Julia did a great job talking about that this morning. And we can't manage something we're not testing. So if we don't have any idea what our soil fertility is, you really need to get a soil sample. And I don't think you have to go crazy on your soil sample. Get exactly what she said this morning. You get your basic soil test, your pH, phosphorus, potassium, some other nutrients, and then organic matter. And that organic matter will give you kind of a benchmark to see how good you're doing as you're moving forward. And we do talk a lot about indicator plants, and here's some indicator plants, and this is a pasture we're doing a bale grazing study in. What indicator plant is this? Broom sage. Who's got broom sage? Don't raise your hand. I think one of the best broom sage fields I've ever seen was at Greg Brand's during one of the field days. And in broom sage is definitely an indicator that something's not quite right. It could be, the old timers will say it's your pH, some will say it's phosphorus, it could be potash, but something's out of balance. And it's hard to just look at a plant. Plants are good to give you an indication that something's not quite right, but really getting a soil test will help you quantify what's not right in the system and what we need to add to bring that fertility into spec. So just mention soil fertility and drought. Nutrients are involved in water relations, especially potassium. So having good potassium can help drought-proof your pastures. And we want to maintain phosphorus and potassium. We don't have to go crazy. We don't need to be in a very high range, but be in the medium range. If we're in the medium range, we're going to be in general pretty good shape on most pastures with good grazing management. And we want to maintain our soil pH somewhere between 6 and 6.4 for most pastures. If we're trying to grow in a mixture of alfalfa and grass, then we need to bump that up to 6.5 to 6.8. But generally speaking, 6.4 is pretty good. It's going to allow us to maintain some legumes in our stand. And of course, good soil fertility is going to promote root growth. It's going to remove that stress from that pasture. So when we get into a drought situation, we're taking one stress away from that pasture by having good soil fertility. And then that pasture is ready to grow after the rain comes. So we're in good shape in terms of fertility when that drought-ending rain comes. Probably the biggest, I think one of the biggest tools that we have for managing drought and grazing systems is rotational stocking. If we do a good job with grazing management, we are going to really have a big benefit in terms of increased drought tolerance in our pastures. It's not perfect. There's nothing that's 100%. But when I manage rotational stocking well, then my pastures are going to go longer into a drought and come out of that drought faster than someone that's has continuous stocking. And there's several reasons for that, and we'll talk about those in a second here. The first one is that what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil surface. We don't talk enough about that, but if my pasture looks like a tabletop, 9 months of the year, then my root system is going to be much, much smaller, and that's going to make my pasture less tolerant to drought stress. When we have good rotational stocking, we're managing that plant canopy, so we're grazing it down to a certain height, we're leaving some residual leaf area, and then allowing it to regrow. And that keeps that plant in a positive carbohydrate status all the time. So carbohydrates are the energy reserves in that plant. I want good energy reserves in my plant all the time. If I have good energy reserves, that plant's going to have energy to regrow with after a moderate drought stress is relieved by rain. So what we manage is residual leaf area, and when we manage residual leaf area, what we're really managing is photosynthesis, right? We're leaving that solar panel there to collect light and turn that light into chemical energy in the form of sugars and carbohydrates. We did an interesting study several years ago. I had an intern, and he took some tall fescue stand, and then he did several things to it. He took lawnmowers. We didn't use livestock. We used a lawnmower, and he mowed it at 1 inch. He did that all summer long, once a week. And then he mowed it at 4 inches once a month. And we had temperature sensors. in that stand. We had a temperature sensor in the crown of the plant, so right at the soil surface, and then we had one that was 4 inches below the soil surface. And we logged temperature every 15 minutes all summer long. Where he left that 4-inch residual and mowed once a month, we had on hot days, the crown of the plant was about 20 to 25 degrees cooler. That's going to have a dramatic impact on the persistence of cool season grasses and grazing systems. It was very interesting where he mowed once a week to 1 inch. We had a higher crown temperature and a higher soil temperature. Not only that, the cool season grasses in about 4 to 5 weeks, we shifted the botanical composition of those stands away from the cool season grass to crabgrass. So we opened that stand up, and crabgrass was coming into that stand because of the way we were managing that defoliation. We also reduce soil moisture loss when we leave residual in pastures. And then those plants are ready to grow, and we can almost get what we're familiar with the term compensatory growth in thin animals. When we put thin animals on a good diet, we can almost get that kind of growth after a drought stress if our pastures are healthy going into that drought stress. They'll recover very quickly after that drought stress. Yeah, so if we can maintain the leaf intact in a grass plant, so when the leaf grows, it has a couple different zones of growth in a grass leaf. So it's got a zone near the base of the leaf blade that's where cell division occurs. So it's making more cells, and then those cells expand with water to when the leaf grows. If we can maintain that leaf during a moderate drought stress, and then we're building, and that cell division keeps going after leaf expansion, cell expansion stops. So we can stockpile a set of cells there at the base of the leaf that are ready to expand but don't have the water. So when the water comes, if we can maintain that bottom of that leaf blade, they can expand very rapidly and get almost that compensatory growth effect in the pasture. This was just an interesting, some things happen by happenstance. This was a tall fescue variety trial, and this was actually in Virginia in the coastal plain, so not an area that's well adapted to tall fescue. But these are our plots, and where it's 3 to 4 inches is where we cut it at a forage harvester, and that was our defoliation height. The farm crew there was doing us a favor. This was not at my research station, but they were trimming around the plots. And they cut around the plots with the lawnmower weekly 1 to 2 inches. And it essentially killed that tall fescue stand around those plots. And that's what happens in a continuous stocking system when we never give that plant time to recover. This was just a nice example of what defoliation height and frequency can do to a pasture. So what's going on underground? And this is something we don't talk enough about. We don't see the roots. And whenever you go into a pasture, go to a field day, dig some plants up and look at the roots. A guy named Kreider with the USDA did a root growth stoppage study about, 75 years ago. And what he found was that removing half of the top of the plant stops root growth temporarily. A single removal of 90% of what's above the ground, so if I had 10 inches of forage and I removed 9, it stopped root growth for 17 days in this particular study. 3 clippings a week, so that would be kind of a continuous stocking system, right? Every time that plant grew a little bit, it was defoliated, the root growth never resumed. And if we removed less than 40% or less of the shoots, then root growth then stopped. This is really important to understand the implications of what you do to the top of that plant has implications to what the root system does below the soil surface. And that's an important part of drought management. If I'm in that 3 clipping a week spot, my pastures are going to have little drought tolerance because the root system is going to be so weak. So we can incorporate drought-tolerant legumes into grazing systems. Who knows what that species is? The Lespedeza, Sericea lespedeza. Good or bad? Yeah, that's probably the accurate answer. It depends, right? So Sericea is used a lot in mineland reclamation. It's kind of an invasive plant. Has some benefits for small ruminants in grazing systems. Some anti-worming properties. It's extremely drought tolerant. It's our only well-adapted warm season perennial species for this region of the country. So I'm not telling you to go out and plant it, but a lot of times you'll have it, especially if you're on land that had some kind of mining, and this was commonly in the reclamation mixes. And the reason it does so well on mine land is because nothing else can grow there. It's very tolerant of lower soil fertility. So alfalfa, of course, has a very big and deep taproot, and it can find water when other plants can't find water. So it's a good legume species to have in a grazing system for a little bit of drought tolerance. High yielding, often called the queen of the forages. I sometimes don't tell Dr. Lacefield, he was my predecessor, and he loves alfalfa, but I often call it a pouty princess. And the reason I call it that is that alfalfa is a great plant. It's well adapted, but it needs deep, well-drained soils that are fertile. You know, it's not going to persist well in marginal soils, and a lot of our pastures are in marginal soils. Of course, it can cause bloat, but normally we wouldn't graze pure alfalfa sand. We'd be grazing a mixture of grass and alfalfa, and that's going to reduce our chances of bloat. And we can have some feed additives or blocks to reduce bloat also. Talked a little bit about Sericea lespedeza, long-lived perennial warm season legume, often referred to as poor man's alfalfa. And there are people that do make some pretty good Sericea lespedeza hay. It can be a little bit of a challenge because it does have a stem on it, and it's important to get that stem crushed during conservation, during mowing, to let the moisture escape. A lot of times the leaves get brittle, and when we handle it, when the leaves are brittle, we'll have a high leaf loss, which reduces forage quality. Its big advantage is its ability to tolerate lower fertility, and that's often what we have in grazing situations. Palatability, it's not the most palatable plant in the world. If it gets much above this tall, then palatability really goes down in there. Animal performance can be fair off of it. We had it in a mine land reclamation study that I worked on when I was a graduate student, and our average daily gains for in a cow-calf system for the calves when we weaned them was about 2.5 pounds a day. And those pastures were primarily tall fescue and Sericea lespedeza. Not great seedling vigor, interestingly enough, but so if we're going to establish it, it's good to try to establish it either into a really thin stand or to establish it by itself, then drill grass back into it. Needs to be rotationally stocked. There's not a lot of variety. There's a number of varieties that have been developed over the years, but the commercial availability of those varieties are not real good. There's about one that you can get, and that's AU Grazer. It's been selected at Auburn University under Grazing. It's got a little bit finer stems, medium levels of tannins. Tannins make that plant not taste so good to the animal, so lower levels are ideal. And then again, used a lot in roadsides and mainly in reclamation. Just want to mention warm season grasses real quick. And of course, we've got our traditional cool season grasses, things like fescue and orchard grass and bluegrass. And they've got 2 humps of growth, right? A hump of growth in the spring and then a secondary hump in the fall usually. And then in the middle of the summer, not much going on. And that's kind of where our warm season grasses come in. And they can kind of fill that spot in the cool season grasses aren't real productive during the summer months. And they can be things like native warm season grasses, Bermuda grass, annuals like crabgrass and sorghum Sudan grass and pearl millet can all work to fill that summer slump in. So let's talk real quick about two of the more traditional ones. And these are annuals. These are pearl millet in the sorghum species. The sorghum species would include sorghum Sudan grass, and then, of course, forage sorghum would be annuals. What's another sorghum species that's a perennial? Johnson grass. Good or bad? Ah, we got a little dissension. I must have a row crop person in here. We'll talk about Johnson grass in a minute. Okay. Crabgrass, is it a weed? Scots would like me to believe it's a weed, right? If you listen to the commercials now, it says, kill your crabgrass and be a better person, right? I don't know. I kind of like crabgrass in pastures. It's well adapted to this whole region, and it's an annual that acts like a perennial through self-reseeding, so it does have to come back from seed every year, but it produces a prolific amount of seed. And then that seed can be the crop for next year with good management. And it's only productive in the summer months, so we really need to have it. If we're going to have a field that we're going to keep in crabgrass, then we need to have some type of winter annual into that field starting in late summer. We would seed a winter annual, something like annual ryegrass or small grain or something like that that's going to be productive until annual ryegrass starts to grow again the next spring. Good yield potential, but where it really excels is forage quality. There was a tremendous amount of work with stocker calves at the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma in the 1980s and 90s. And R.L. Dalrymple showed average daily gains of about 1.75 pounds on stocker calves with no supplementation grazing crabgrass. So it's a pretty good forage quality. No prussic acid. Prussic acid can be a problem in our sorghum species. Can accumulate nitrates under very heavy nitrogen fertilization, more heavy than we usually use in a grazing system. Bermuda grass. Do we have Bermuda grass in Tennessee? Like it or not, it's here, right? So it's well adapted to this whole Mid-South region. And Roger and I were just talking before the meeting, the availability of sprigs has almost gone nothing. So most Bermuda grass has to be established vegetatively from a living piece of the plant, and that's called a sprig. And availability of the sprigs have gone down a huge amount. So it's hard to get sprigs, and when you can get sprigs, they're not certified anymore, so you're not sure exactly what you're buying. And then you have to transport them to your field and get them into the ground somehow, and we don't have a lot of equipment to do that with. There has been some work on development of seeded Bermuda grasses. Are they good as the sprig types that have been established in the Deep South? Probably not quite as good, but it's much easier to plant those than the sprigs. And we have availability to everything we need to plant a seeded Bermuda grass. You plant it just like any other small seeded forage. The tricky part about the seeded types is that they come as either a single pure variety or they come as a blend. And there's nothing wrong with blends, but you have to know what's in the blend. So we're kind of in the northern part of the adaptation zone for Bermuda grass. So we really don't want things like Arizona common or giant Bermuda grass in those blends because they don't have the cold tolerance to survive here. So make sure you know what's in that blend, and ask your seed guy what's in that blend to make sure that it's going to be something that has the ability to overwinter here. And the tricky part about those blends is that they often keep the same name every year, but what's in that bag can be different. And that's a challenge. I see Roger nodding his head. That's a dirty secret of the seed industry, right? So we call that a branded product. All right, then we have native grasses. And native grasses can be quite drought tolerant in grazing systems. So things like switchgrass and Indian grass, big and little blue stem eastern gamma grass, depending on where you're at in the landscape position, can all be can all be a good part of a drought management system. So having those native grasses to go to when things get dry during the summer months. And they have quite an extensive root system. So that means they can find water when other plants cannot find water during dry times. Irrigation, is this a viable option in the humid eastern United States? I don't know. It's an option. Whether it's viable or not, and whether it makes economic sense is going to depend a little bit on your farm, right? So we know that during a drought, if we've got irrigation, we can grow 3 to 5 times as much forage, right, during that drought. And we saw a lot of people, after a bad drought in western Kentucky in 2012, a lot of people put center pivot irrigation in, but we haven't had a really bad drought since they put that irrigation in. So, investing in that infrastructure and then not using it is questionable sometimes. So again, a large upfront cost, may not use every year. The place where it becomes more viable is if you're on an old tobacco farm or something and you've already got that infrastructure for some limited irrigation. Then it may make more sense to make that part of your drought management program. Anybody ever irrigate tobacco in here? It's not as much fun as it sounds, right? Irrigation's a lot of work. You're not just flipping a switch and going away. You're sitting there with it. You're making sure the water's coming out right and nothing's plugged up and so on and so forth. So it'll work you for sure. If you do decide to make this part of your drought management strategy, then you really need to think about what you're going to irrigate. Warm season grasses in general will produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used compared with the cool season grass in the summer months. They're just more efficient at growing at higher temperatures. And that means that we need to be irrigating warm season grasses, not cool season grasses during the summer months. And we've got, these aren't so new anymore, but we've got pasture pods, and we can drag those around pastures and hook them up to a trunk line that you have to dig in and establish pastures with these pod systems. The videos are a lot better than real life, right? So when I watch the videos online, they're dragging them around and it's really easy. Everything's easier in a video than it is in real life. So just keep that in mind if you're going to go to an irrigation system. Okay, another important strategy, and probably one that makes the most sense for states like Kentucky and in Tennessee, where we have pretty good precipitation generally and short-term drought stress, is to be ready to feed some conserved forage in that system. That's a good drought management tool, and it's nothing flashy, but it's just a good way to keep your pastures healthy during a drought. We rotate around through our system. We get back to our first paddock. It hasn't regrown because it's been dry. Have the discipline to put those animals somewhere and feed some conserved forage. That's a pretty solid drought management strategy. Now, naturally, we want to strive to reduce the amount of conserved forage in grazing systems because it's an expensive part of grazing systems. Doesn't mean we never need hay, and that's not right. We're always going to need some hay. Hay is a necessary evil in grazing systems in the humid eastern United States. The question is do we buy it or make it? When I sit down and I look at a budget for making hay, it's going to cost me $100 to $120 a ton to make hay. If I'm honest with myself, and I'm accounting for equipment costs and some labor. We don't often charge our labor, but I'm accounting for some labor and then all the other inputs in hay production. It's going to be about $100 a ton to make hay. Can I buy it for $100 a ton? Most years I can buy it for $100 a ton. So what do I get when I buy hay in that I don't get when I make it myself? Good. Extra carbon. What else do I get in hay? Herbicides. Good. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but you can get carryover herbicides in hay, especially if they're using aminopyrrolid products. So be careful with that. What else do I get? I get fertilizer, right? I'm getting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and other nutrients that are coming into that hay. So when I bring that hay into my system, I'm getting the feed value out of that hay, and then I'm getting a coupon for the nutrients that I'm bringing into my system. And that coupon is worth, I don't know, $40 or $50 a ton, depending on fertilizer prices. So buying hay and bringing it into your system, if you avoid herbicides, can be a great way to bring nutrients into the system to help build soil fertility over time. Not the same as putting commercial fertilizer on, but over time you can build soil fertility. We've got a bale grazing study at the research station. The first year of the study, we raised potash levels in that field 40 pounds an acre. Pretty impressive in one cycle of bale grazing. So it's certainly a tool for building soil fertility over time. Weeds, right? Yeah, you can bring weeds in. There's no question about that. What's a weed in a grazing? Oh, crap. Got 5 minutes left. What's a weed in a grazing system? You got it right there. It's easy to define a weed in a row crop system, right? That's something other than corn or soybeans. In a pasture, if I can figure out how to get them to eat it, then I don't necessarily have to worry quite as much about having it. Okay. I think I'm going to skip ahead. You said I have 10 minutes or 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides here. Let's see here. Drought. I do want to just take a minute and talk about hay and grazing systems, because I think that's really important to realize is that when we look at production costs and cow-calf systems, and this is from a survey of 150 or 138 different farms that was done by the University of Minnesota, and they actually got the numbers from the farm and looked at the production costs within the system. The largest single production cost in a cow-calf system, regardless of what state you're in, is going to be hay and feed, hay and winter feed. 50% of the total budget. And that'll vary between 40 and 60, right, depending on the operation, but that's a huge cost. That's a huge cost in system. So when we think about improving the profitability of a cow-calf operation, I mean, the first thing we need to think about doing is reducing the amount of stored forage in your system. That's really, really, really important. And I want to kind of set the stage for talking a little bit about hay quality. This number is really scary. Total cost from this survey of producing a cow-calf unit, over $1,000. Now that's an average, right? Everybody knows what an average is. Average means there's something above it and something below it. Kind of like having 2 pails of water, right? We've got 1 pail of water that's ice cold, 1 pail of water that's scalding hot. I stick a foot in each one. On average, I'm comfortable, but it hurts like hell, right? That's exactly what an average is. So that's a scary number to me, that $1,000. If we're not below that now, we're going to be in trouble when that cow-calf cycle comes down again. This is another interesting number. This is total production costs over time. This is the last 25 years. I went back and looked through the survey data for 25 years. Look at how production costs have grown over the last 25 years. If we're not below that line, we're going to be in trouble in the next several years as the cow-calf cycle comes back down. Last scary graph, and then we'll talk about a little bit about hay quality. But this is hay production per beef cow in Kentucky. So Daryl Peel did this same analysis for Oklahoma, and I watched a webinar on it. And in Oklahoma, there was a steady increase in the amount of hay produced per beef cow unit. And so I came back and asked our economists to do the same thing, and this is the graph that he came up with. As you can see, since about the mid-1980s or so, there's been a steady increase in the amount of hay that we produce per cow-calf unit in Kentucky. That's not good. Hay is negatively correlated, in most cases, with profitability in cow-calf operations. So it's really important that we think about what's happening here. And Daryl Peel went through and kind of tried to figure it out. He said bigger cows can account for some of the increase. How big are our cows now? Who's got 1,200-pound cows? A few hands. So when I was in Virginia for a meeting this winter, I said, well, maybe our cows aren't 1,250 pounds anymore. Maybe they're 1,300 or 1,400 pounds. Somebody came up to me on break and said, I sold 3 cull cows last week. Guess how much they weighed? 1,800 pounds. That's exactly what it was. Our cows are bigger than you think. And that's an issue in grazing systems. You know, they're not going to be quite as efficient as a smaller animal in that grazing system. I can have more cows per unit land area if they're a little bit smaller and produce more calves per unit land area, even though the calves may be slightly smaller. Sometimes they're not smaller. All right, increase in hay waste. That can account for some. And then a longer total feeding period. So we're doing something wrong. If we're getting more rain, we're getting milder winters, we need to have a shorter hay feeding period, not a longer one. So those are just all things to consider as we move ahead. So the question was it a lack of fertility in the hay? And I don't know about that. I'm not 100% sure. We do have some issues with the nutritional value of hay in many cases in states like Tennessee and Kentucky. And I wanted to talk, how am I doing? Do I have just a couple minutes left? Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about was just a little bit on hay quality. So what does hay quality mean? I always like to ask that to groups when I talk a little bit about hay. What's hay quality? I mean, we use all kinds of terms to define it: acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, crude protein, in vitro, true digestibility, and the list goes on and on and on. We add more terms every year, but essentially, hay quality is the ability of that hay to produce a desired animal response. And that's a little bit of a moving target, right? So what's a quality hay for a brood cow is not going to be a quality hay for a dairy cow or a horse. So the point that I want to make is that we kind of need to define what that is, what quality hay is for our operation. And this is just a list of the nutritional requirements of various animal classes. And what I want to point out is that there's a big range, but even within a beef cow, depending on the stage of production she is in the cycle, her requirements can be quite different. So a dry cow, would have a 7% crude protein versus a 10 or 11% crude protein for a lactating cow. Same thing for TDN. Look how much TDN drops when she's dry, 50% versus 60%. So understanding what you need is really important for developing a quality of hay that's going to meet the nutritional needs of your animals. If you've got brood cows, you don't really need dairy cow hay, but you need enough nutritional value in that hay to meet the requirements of those cows. So the single most important factor impacting hay quality is stage of maturity at harvest. Single most one. There's lots of factors that can impact hay quality, but this is the single most important factor. If we can cut that hay on time, then it's going to dramatically increase the quality of the hay that we're feeding in our operation. And this is why. So as that plant matures from vegetative to full bloom, we get a decrease in digestibility, and the animal can eat less of it. So we get a decrease in intake. Our yield does go up. Where these two lines cross at, that's kind of where we want to be at when we harvest that hay. So as that seed head's just emerging from the grass plant, or we're kind of at early to mid bloom for the legume plant, that's where we need to be to optimize. And again, we're talking about optimizing, not maximizing, but optimizing forage quality and yield. Unfortunately, a lot of our hay is harvested here. And that's why we get hay that's 7% crude protein and 45% TDN. That's not going to meet the nutritional requirements even of a dry cow. So it's important to think about stage of maturity at harvest. This is from one of our publications, Quality Hay Production, and this is the effect of stage of maturity of tall fescue hay on forage quality and animal gain. If you think about one graph as you go home today, think about this one. If we look at this, harvesting when we should at the late boot, we had 13.8% crude protein. If seed is forming on that grass or falling off of that grass when we harvest it, it drops that crude protein to 7.6%. Same thing for digestibility, 68 to 56%. Dry matter intake, so the animals can eat less. At late boot, they could eat 13 pounds a day versus 8.6 pounds a day. And then if we look at average daily gain, this is where the rubber really hits the road. These are our calves that are being fed this hay. We had 1.4 pounds of gain per day at the late boot stage versus 0.42 pounds when the seed was actively forming on that plant. That's really, really important. I mean, this drives the point of why it's so important to harvest our hay on time. Why don't, I'm going to stop in 1 minute, I promise you. Why don't we do a better job at harvesting hay on time? Good, that's a good answer. There's lots of reasons, right? So most of us work public jobs, right? And somebody's writing us a paycheck, then we're kind of obliged to show up to work. Cattle and forage are sometimes a secondary enterprise, especially on tobacco farms or even on row crop operations. We kind of cut the hay when we get around to it. Old equipment. Who has old equipment? I know Greg Brand does. But, yeah, I mean, old equipment, and what happens when you go to use old equipment? You know, you're fixing it, and then you got to round parts up and so forth. But the big one is what you guys said, is the weather. You know, it's just hard to get 4 days in a row to harvest that hay. And that's what this chart is showing. These are the number of baling days. A baling day is 3 days, followed by a fourth day to bale on. And in these two periods, 2000 to 2021 versus 2017 to 2021, baling days have decreased in Kentucky, you know, somewhere between 1 and 2 baling days a year. So you're saying, and that's for May, and you're saying, well, one to 2, that's not a big deal, right? It is if you only had 6 to start with or 4 to start with. So it is a pretty big deal. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
We have time for one question. I live on the Conserved plateau. When is the best time to feed stockpile fescue?
So the question is when's the best time to feed stockpile tall fescue? Naturally, as we go through winter, we're going to lose a little bit of forage quality on it, but stockpile actually holds forage quality fairly well. I would say the best time to feed it would be later in the winter months. And the reason I say that is that those are the times when it's a little more challenging to get hay out and get hay fed. If I feed a little bit of hay in late summer or early fall, I can kind of push that in, and then I'm grazing instead of trying to haul hay out in the middle of the winter when it's really miserable out. I don't know if there's a perfect answer for that. The other thing that happens in stockpile tall fescue that we don't talk enough about is that we can accumulate relatively high rates of ergovaline in fall-grown stockpile tall fescue. And those ergovalines tend to decline after the first of the year. So if I'm pushing that, grazing those stockpiled pastures off till after January 1, then I'll tend to have less problems with tall fescue toxicosis. And we do have that in the winter months, right? It's causing vascular constriction. It's hard to get blood to the extremities, the ear tips, and then its tail switches, and the feet, right? It's for fescue foot. Okay, thank you.